It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in Washington, D.C., or at least as ordinary as it could be in the heart of the most powerful government in the world. The White House press briefing room was packed. Journalists from major networks, CNN, MSNBC, The New York Times, sat shoulder to shoulder, their laptops open, recorders running, pens tapping impatiently against notepads. The air was thick with anticipation. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest and most dynamic White House press secretary in modern history, was about to take the podium. Since assuming her role, she had become known for her no-nonsense approach, delivering facts with laser precision and countering narratives with an almost surgical dismantling of talking points. Today, however, was different. The country was still buzzing from a major scandal involving a prominent liberal senator who had been caught in a staggering case of hypocrisy. Just days earlier, Senator Robert Callaway, a self-proclaimed champion of corporate accountability, had been exposed for secretly funneling campaign funds into offshore accounts. The same man who had spent years lecturing Americans about paying their fair share had, in reality, been avoiding taxes on millions. The revelation had rocked the political landscape, exposing deep-seated double standards within the progressive establishment. But what made this briefing particularly tense was how the mainstream media had handled the scandal, or rather, how they had ignored it. Liberal reporters had gone out of their way to downplay the controversy, instead shifting the focus to trivial stories about the administration's policies. Conservative outlets, on the other hand, had been relentless in their coverage, demanding accountability. Karoline knew exactly what she was walking into. She had seen the headlines, more accurately the lack of them, from left-leaning networks. She had read the softball questions they had prepared for her, questions meant to distract from the growing scandal. But she wasn't about to let them off the hook. As the clock struck noon, she walked onto the stage with confidence, her blonde hair neatly styled, her navy blue blazer sharp, her expression unreadable. She adjusted the microphone and let her gaze sweep across the room. A slight smirk tugged at the corner of her lips as she saw the nervous shifting in the seats. They knew what was coming. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "I know you all have a lot of questions today, so let's get started." A familiar voice cut through the room. It was Brian Hastings from the New York Times, always eager to set the tone. "Ms. Leavitt, does the administration take responsibility for the rising cost of living, given its policies on—" She held up a hand. "Brian, I'll get to economic policy in a moment, but first, let's address the elephant in the room." She leaned forward slightly, making sure every camera caught what she was about to say. "This morning, we learned that Senator Robert Callaway, the same man who has lectured this nation about wealth redistribution and corporate greed, has been caught engaging in the very behavior he condemns. He has evaded taxes on millions while pushing for higher taxes on hardworking Americans. My question to you," she paused for effect, "is why aren't any of you talking about it?" The room went silent. Brian shifted uncomfortably. Karoline tilted her head. "No, really. I've read your pieces, Brian. Your publication has run front-page stories on conservative politicians for far less. Yet when it's one of your own, suddenly there's no rush to report. Why is that?" She turned her gaze to Emily Carter from MSNBC. "Emily, your network spent 3 consecutive days covering an alleged ethics violation by a Republican mayor last year. Are we to assume that tax fraud by a sitting senator isn't newsworthy anymore?" Emily's face reddened. She scrambled for words, but Karoline wasn't done. She pointed at Jason Wilcox from the Washington Post. "Jason, your paper ran an op-ed just last week about Republican corruption. I'm curious, when can we expect a similar piece on Callaway?" A nervous cough echoed through the room. Karoline clasped her hands together, letting the weight of her words settle. "It seems," she continued, her tone measured but firm, "that hypocrisy isn't just a political issue, it's a media issue as well." The press corps shifted in their seats, murmurs spreading. This wasn't going the way they had planned, and Karoline was just getting started. The tension in the room was palpable. A few reporters exchanged nervous glances, while others furiously typed notes, scrambling to find a way to pivot. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to let them escape that easily. She picked up a sheet of paper from the podium and held it up. I took the liberty of reviewing your network's coverage over the past 72 hours. Here's what I found. She glanced down and began reading. CNN ran 6 segments on rising political extremism, but failed to mention Callaway's scandal even once. MSNBC dedicated 2 entire primetime slots to attacking conservative tax policies, but somehow ignored the fact that a liberal senator was actively dodging taxes. And the New York Times? Not a single headline on their homepage about Callaway's offshore accounts. Yet they found space for a think piece about the dangers of conservative media influence. She set the paper down. So I'll ask again, why aren't you covering this? The silence was deafening. Finally, Brian Hastings from the New York Times cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. Ms. Leavitt, with all due respect, isn't it the role of this administration to focus on governance rather than policing the media? Karoline chuckled. Oh, Brian, come on. You don't get to lecture me about the role of the administration when your own paper has spent years using selective outrage to shape public perception. The media has made itself the 4th branch of government, holding press conferences, fact-checking in real time, and influencing elections through coverage or lack thereof. But now, when the spotlight is turned on you, suddenly you want to play the "we're just observers" card. Brian opened his mouth to reply, but Karoline was already moving on. Let's talk about the double standard, shall we? She pulled out another document. Last year, a Republican congressman was accused, without evidence, of accepting bribes. The media ran with it for weeks. The FBI later cleared him, but by then, the damage was done. You painted him as corrupt, and no amount of truth could erase that stain. She placed the document down and met their eyes. Meanwhile, Callaway's scandal is backed by bank records, leaked emails, and sworn testimony. Yet none of you have given it the same level of scrutiny. Why? Jason Wilcox from the Washington Post hesitated before responding. Well, we simply haven't had time to fully investigate. Karoline smirked. That's interesting, Jason, because your paper managed to put together a 2,000-word exposé on a Republican staffer's travel expenses in just 48 hours. But when it comes to a Democratic senator laundering campaign money, suddenly you need more time. The room was growing increasingly restless. Reporters exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they were losing control of the narrative. Emily Carter from MSNBC finally snapped. Look, Ms. Leavitt, the media's job is to report responsibly. We don't just run stories without vetting them. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Really, Emily? Because I seem to recall your network breathlessly covering the Steele dossier for months, despite it being riddled with falsehoods. Did MSNBC vet that story before plastering it on every screen in America? Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. Karoline leaned forward, her voice dropping just slightly. You don't get to cherry-pick which scandals deserve coverage. The American people see through it. And that's why trust in the media is at an all-time low. The silence that followed was deafening. The reporters knew they had walked into this briefing expecting to control the narrative. Instead, Karoline had flipped the script, exposing their hypocrisy on live television. And she was far from finished. The silence in the briefing room stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with. Some reporters shifted in their seats, while others pretended to take notes, desperate to look occupied. The cameras caught it all, Karoline standing firm at the podium, unshaken, while the so-called watchdogs of democracy squirmed under the weight of their own double standards. Karoline let the tension build for a few seconds before continuing. You know, it's funny, she said, her tone almost conversational. Every time there's a conservative caught in a scandal, even an alleged one, the media floods the airwaves with non-stop coverage. There's panel discussions, expert analyses, dramatic headlines, and moral outrage. She pulled out another sheet of paper and glanced at it. Last year, when a Republican governor was accused of misusing campaign funds, MSNBC ran 42 segments on it in 1 week. 42. The New York Times published 11 op-eds condemning him. But now, when a liberal senator is caught committing actual financial crimes, when there are documents proving it, you all suddenly forget how to do your jobs. The room was still. The only sound was the distant clicking of cameras capturing the moment. Karoline scanned the room, locking eyes with each reporter in turn. Let's make something clear. This administration isn't here to beg for fair coverage. We don't expect it. We've seen the bias for years. But what we won't do is sit silently while you gaslight the American people into thinking you're neutral observers. You're not. She let her words hang in the air. Some reporters avoided her gaze. Others clenched their jaws, realizing they were losing control of the narrative. Then, finally, someone tried to push back. David Ramirez from ABC News cleared his throat. Ms. Leavitt, with respect, isn't it a bit extreme to accuse the entire press corps of bias? We report the facts. Karoline didn't miss a beat. Oh, you report the facts? Okay, let's test that theory. She reached under the podium and pulled out a binder. This right here is a collection of headlines from major media outlets over the past 2 years. Let's take a quick trip down memory lane, shall we? She flipped open the binder and began reading. From the New York Times, conservative hypocrisy on full display in ethics investigation. She turned the page. From the Washington Post, Republicans face reckoning over corruption allegations. Another page. From CNN, GOP scandal threatens to undermine party's moral authority. She shut the binder with a loud thud. Do you see the pattern? When a Republican is accused of something, whether proven or not, the headlines are filled with judgment. There's no hesitation to call them corrupt, unethical, a threat to democracy. But when a Democrat is caught red-handed, suddenly, the language shifts. She pulled out another sheet of paper. Here's how the media is framing Senator Callaway's scandal. From CNN, Callaway faces questions over tax practices. From MSNBC, Callaway's financial controversy explained. From the Washington Post, a closer look at Callaway's finances. Karoline let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. Not one of these headlines calls it what it is. Corruption, fraud, criminal behavior. Instead, you soften the language. You give him the benefit of the doubt. You explain it rather than condemn it. She shook her head in mock disappointment. But no, David, you're right. I should totally believe you guys are just reporting the facts. David swallowed hard and lowered his gaze to his notes. The rest of the press corps sat frozen, unsure whether to fight back or stay silent and hope the moment passed. But Karoline wasn't done. She had come prepared, and she was about to deliver the moment that would be replayed on every news channel in America. The tension in the briefing room had reached a boiling point. Every reporter in the room knew what was happening. Karoline Leavitt had taken control of the narrative and was exposing them in real time. Some had given up trying to push back. Others were still desperate to salvage their credibility. One of them, Marcus Ellison from The Atlantic, decided to take a shot. Ms. Leavitt, he began, forcing a casual chuckle to hide his nervousness. Surely you can acknowledge that there's a difference between responsible journalism and partisan attacks. The media's role is to report the truth, not to act as an extension of any political party. Karoline's eyes gleamed. Marcus, she said slowly, you just perfectly described what journalism should be. But that's not what we have today, is it? She took a step back from the podium, gesturing toward the room. Let's be honest. This isn't journalism, it's activism. The press selectively decides which scandals matter and which don't. You amplify one party's mistakes while downplaying or outright ignoring the others. That's not reporting. That's manipulation. She turned directly to Marcus. And since you brought up partisan attacks, let's talk about how your publication covered Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination. Marcus stiffened. Karoline grabbed another sheet from her binder. When Kavanaugh was accused, without evidence, of misconduct, your magazine ran an entire special edition titled The Reckoning of Brett Kavanaugh. You treated unverified claims as gospel. You called for his impeachment before he was even confirmed. And when those accusations fell apart, did you issue a retraction? No. You just moved on, hoping people would forget. She let that hang in the air before flipping to the next page. But now, when actual evidence emerges against Senator Callaway, your magazine writes a think piece about how Tax laws are complicated. A few reporters let out involuntary scoffs. They knew she was right. Marcus fumbled for words. That's not a fair comparison. Karoline tilted her head. Isn't it? Or is it just inconvenient? She wasn't waiting for an answer. She turned to the entire room, eyes blazing. The American people see what's happening here. They see the hypocrisy. They see the double standards. And they see you, every time you twist a story to fit your narrative. She gestured to the cameras. Millions of Americans are watching this right now, and I guarantee they're not surprised by your silence. They expect it, because this is what you do. She placed her hands on the podium, leaning in slightly. But here's the real kicker, she said, her voice lower, more intense. Even if you refuse to cover Callaway's corruption, even if you spin this story into nothing, you won't win. Because the truth is out. And no matter how hard you try to bury it, the American people will find it. Silence. For the first time in a long time, the press corps had nothing to say. They had come into this briefing expecting to corner the administration. Instead, they had been dismantled on live television in front of the entire country. Karoline straightened up and smiled. The battle already won. Any other questions? The silence in the briefing room was deafening. No one dared to speak. Reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing toward their colleagues as if silently pleading for someone, anyone, to take back control of the room. But it was already too late. Karoline Leavitt had done what no White House press secretary before her had ever done. She had humiliated the entire liberal media establishment, exposing their hypocrisy, bias, and double standards in front of a live national audience. The cameras captured every second of it. The American people had just witnessed the so-called defenders of democracy cower under the weight of their own lies. Karoline knew this moment wouldn't just be a headline for the day. It would be remembered for years. Finally, a hand hesitantly went up. It was Jennifer Carlson from NBC News, her face slightly pale. She cleared her throat, trying to mask her unease. Ms. Leavitt, she started cautiously, don't you think this administration should be focused on governing rather than picking fights with the press? Isn't this kind of confrontation counterproductive? Karoline smirked, knowing exactly what was happening. When the media couldn't win an argument, they shifted tactics. They wanted to paint her as hostile, aggressive, even dangerous. But she wasn't about to let them rewrite the narrative. She clasped her hands together and gave a slight tilt of her head, as if pondering the question. Then she responded, Jennifer, that's an interesting way to phrase it. You see, when the press goes after conservatives, when they smear them, misrepresent their words, and push misleading narratives, none of you call that picking a fight. That's just reporting the news, right? She let the question sit for a beat before continuing. But when I stand up here and demand accountability from the same press that claims to hold others accountable, now it's a problem? Jennifer shifted in her seat. Karoline's voice hardened slightly. Let's set the record straight. This administration isn't here to make the press feel comfortable. We're here to serve the American people. And part of that means calling out hypocrisy when we see it. She turned to the cameras. So, to answer your question, no, this is not counterproductive. What's counterproductive is a press corps that picks and chooses which scandals to report based on political affiliation. What's counterproductive is journalists who act as activists rather than truth seekers. And what's counterproductive is expecting this administration to sit back and accept that. She straightened up, eyes scanning the room once more. Now, if anyone has an actual policy question, I'd be happy to answer it. Otherwise, we're done here. Not a single hand went up. Karoline gave a satisfied nod, picked up her notes, and stepped away from the podium. The moment she left the room, the press corps erupted into hushed but frantic conversations. Some reporters angrily whispered to one another, while others typed furiously on their laptops, desperate to spin the narrative before the clips from the briefing went viral. But it was no use. The damage was done. Within minutes, social media exploded. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube were flooded with clips of Karoline's takedown. The hashtags #Leavitt destroys the media and #press conference bloodbath shot to the top of the trending list. Conservative commentators hailed it as a defining moment. This wasn't just a press briefing, one Fox News anchor said that evening. This was an execution of media hypocrisy, carried out with surgical precision. Even some moderate and independent voices admitted that Karoline had exposed a real problem. "I don't always agree with this administration," one independent journalist tweeted. But Leavitt just gave the media the reckoning they've deserved for years. Liberal outlets scrambled to contain the damage. CNN framed the briefing as an unprecedented attack on journalistic integrity. MSNBC called it a dangerous precedent. The New York Times ran an op-ed decrying the rise of authoritarian hostility toward the free press. But no matter how they tried to spin it, the truth was clear. Karoline Leavitt had changed the game. For the first time in years, the media had been forced to face its own hypocrisy. And whether they liked it or not, the American people were watching. As Karoline walked through the White House hallways, she allowed herself a small smile. This was only the beginning, and the media had just been put on notice.